I rise today to support the underlying bill we're talking about here, which is the Defense Authorization Bill. At a time of a rapidly deteriorating security environment around the world, we need to modify our policies, from the violence in Iraq and Syria to China's aggressive land reclamation in the South China Sea to Russia's activities on the eastern border of Ukraine. As we talk here today, that's going on. We live in a world that is a lot less safe and less friendly to U.S. interests. Every day, we see more of this, and frankly, it's time for us here in the United States Senate to help by changing some of our policy approaches to address this changing and more dangerous situation we see around the world. I would hope we could do this on a bipartisan basis. Our differences with regard to other issues tend to be more pronounced, but with regard to national security, normally we come together. And I'm concerned with what I'm hearing, at least from some of the debate I've heard on the floor here, where it sounds like some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would like to actually shut down this debate, to not have a debate on some of these amendments and not have some votes on some of these amendments and not have a vote on this bill to try to adjust our national security posture so that we can address these new challenges around the world. Doesn't mean that everything that this side of the aisle wants to do would be accepted. Democrats would have the chance to offer their ideas, and we would have a good debate on it, and they would have a say in it. You would need Democrat support to get the legislation done. But let's have that debate. Let's have that discussion. So I would hope that what I'm hearing is not accurate. I would hope that we would be able to come together and continue this discussion, be able to have votes on amendments, be able to have votes on the final bill, and be able to help to the extent we can here in the United States Senate to adjust our foreign policy and our national security policy to address these very real threats we see emerging all over the world. I'll give you an example of one, and I'm going to offer it today. This is an amendment that has to do with Ukraine. As some of you know, the situation in Ukraine has deteriorated significantly in the last year or so, and it has so because Russia not only invaded Crimea and took that part of Ukraine, but they're also now continuing their aggression on the border of Ukraine. And this is a situation that affects us as Americans because Ukraine is our ally, and Ukraine is a country that has decided to stand with us. And it's time for us and the other NATO countries to stand with them. Our policy toward Ukraine, in my view, has been not just insufficient, but it's been kind of piecemeal. We haven't had a strategy to deal with this issue. And so what this amendment attempts to do is to take the language that's in the underlying legislation, already in the bill that the committee has put together, and improve it so that indeed we do have a more comprehensive strategy toward Ukraine, which is incredibly important, not just for Ukraine, but for the international order, for our national security, and for the ability for us to help stop this aggression in Europe. The first really since World War II that we've seen like this, where a country is going across another country's boundaries and actually violating territorial integrity. I visited Ukraine a couple months ago. I was there in April. I got to see some of the conflict consequences firsthand. And for those of you who've been to Ukraine, a number of my colleagues have, including Senator Durbin, who just got back from Ukraine, I think they would all agree with me that Ukraine is in a state of war, and it's under siege. And it makes it much more difficult for Ukraine to do what they know they need to do, which is to improve their economy, to deal with corruption, to have more transparency, to become more like those countries that they want to emulate, the European countries, the United States of America. They are attempting to do that, but boy, it's difficult when you've got this conflict on your border where your troops are being killed, where your civilians are being killed, where you've got to devote enormous amounts of time and resources. Just this week, I had the opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister of Ukraine and the Finance Minister, both of whom are in town. In fact, we met with them yesterday as part of the Ukrainian caucus, something I co-founded with Senator Durbin. And I will tell you, talking to them, it's very troubling. Very troubling to hear what's happening in their country right now. So, as some of you know, there's supposed to be a ceasefire in place. It came from the second, what's called Minsk agreement. Whatever semblance of credibility of this Minsk ceasefire had left, and I don't think it had much, it's now totally crumbled. Just last week, a combined Russian separatist force launched a major assault to the north and southwest of the province of Donetsk. Donetsk is one of those areas, oblast, also known as an oblast or a province, where there's a lot of Russian and Russian separatist activity. They were focused on the strategic town of Mariinka. You probably saw some of this on TV. Very troubling that once again it looks like these separatist forces backed by Russia and Russian equipment, directly involved in this are beginning to push back into Ukraine again. The casualty reports are still coming in, but it appears that dozens have been killed or wounded in this assault, according to BBC. So these independent news organizations are following this, and I hope that all of us are focused on this. The United States intelligence in the area is not what it ought to be, frankly, in my view, but we do need to rely on some of these media sources, and it's very clear that in terms of this assault, they were using tanks, they were using heavy multiple launch rocket systems. Over 1,000 men were involved. So clearly, this is something that is not only a serious military exercise, it's one that's backed by Russia, using Russian equipment. We've seen just how committed the Russian government is to this, to promoting instability in that region of the world. They are committed. The question is whether we're committed to step up and support the people of Ukraine. Something, in my view, the NATO forces, the United States should have done a long time ago, not by us getting involved directly, and frankly, that's not what the Ukrainians are asking for. They're asking for assistance and aid to be able to defend themselves. They're asking for us to help them to be able to stop this assault by giving them just the basic weaponry they need to stop tanks, potentially to stop aircraft if aircraft get involved, to be able, again, to stop the invasion and to protect the territorial integrity of the country of Ukraine. The President and some of his top advisors continue to stand in the way of meaningful U.S. and NATO action. They have told me they fear that it would provoke Russia, as if deadly clashes like the one we saw last week and, in fact, yesterday, continue to see today probably, or the steady stream of Russian tanks, artillery pieces, and soldiers into Ukraine aren't evidence enough that NATO and American restraint has not de-escalated this conflict. In fact, I think in a way it has emboldened the Russians. It has inflamed it. So, again, we're not talking about U.S. troops. What we are talking about is helping this country that is our ally, that has turned to us through NATO. We want them to be able to defend themselves. The President continues to enforce this de facto embargo on any kind of significant weapons that Ukraine has said it needs to defend itself. And he does that despite an overwhelming bipartisan consensus here in this body and in the other body, in the House, that it's time to increase this help. That would include lethal and non-lethal assistance to Ukraine. Congress has voted repeatedly to do just that, most notably in the Ukrainian Freedom Support Act, which was signed into law by President Obama in December. But it also provided the President a national security waiver, so he didn't have to do what we think he should do, which is to help them to defend themselves. The administration continues to withhold these arms, and it's time for that to end. There's really very little disagreement on the capabilities that Ukraine needs. And my amendment, which is Amendment number 1850, modifies and builds on the great work that Senator McCain and Senator Reid and others have already done in the bill. If you look at Section 1251 of the bill, you'll see there's already assistance being provided to Ukraine, about $300 million. Our amendment directs the Secretary of Defense to spend this money in a way that, again, all of us know is the appropriate way to ensure that we get the most bang for the buck and that we are giving them the assistance that they really need. It requires the Secretary of Defense to spend on a number of critical capabilities they need to defend themselves, including real-time intelligence, medium and long-range counter-artillery radars, defensive lethal assistance such as anti-tank weapons, UAVs, secure communications, and training to develop key combat planning and support capabilities, both at the small unit level and at the brigade level. So it provides, frankly, less wiggle room for the administration by laying out exactly what is needed, what's being asked for by the Ukrainian military, and what, in this chamber, having done a lot of work in this area through our Ukrainian caucus and through other sources, we know is necessary. Half of this $300 million under our amendment would be fenced off until at least $60 million of it is spent on the important capabilities the Ukrainians really need and have requested. That's the real-time intelligence, defensive lethal assistance, and counter-artillery batteries. If the administration fails to use this money for the purposes specified, then they've got to use it to support other nations facing an increased risk of Russian aggression, countries like Georgia, Moldova. The amendment also requires DoD to report on the quantity and the type of security assistance being provided to Ukraine and how it complies with the purposes that are established in the legislation. So the amendment helps ensure that U.S. military assistance provides assistance that truly will have a meaningful impact on the ground, and it gives Ukraine the tools it needs to defend itself. It will also finally increase the cost of Russia's aggression. At no point has President Putin's decision to escalate this war been costly enough to force President Putin and the Russians to fundamentally reconsider their strategy. The annexation of Crimea the campaign to destabilize and then invade eastern Ukraine last summer and fall, and the recent offensive have all happened despite a flurry of Western attempts to force a negotiated settlement. In fact, each temporary ceasefire, in some senses, has merely legitimized what the Russians have done. So when there's this flurry of diplomatic activity, it tends to be after the Russians have made gains on the ground, and then it accepts those gains on the ground as the basis for negotiations, granting the separatists and their Russian supporters moral and, I would say, some legal equivalency that they simply don't deserve. There's a pattern here. They seize the land, they preserve their gains through an internationally mediated ceasefire, then they break that ceasefire, as they're doing right now, to seize more land, and then use a new ceasefire to secure acceptance of their new gains. This has got to stop. The Obama administration and some EU members have been so fixated on ensuring that the successful implementation of the February ceasefire is a goal in and of itself that they've lost sight of this broader policy objective a ceasefire should be working to achieve, which should be the defense of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity and support for the economic and political reforms that Ukraine needs. And let me underscore that. It's very difficult for them to undertake the economic reforms they need and the political reforms that they need with this siege going on. And that's what we need. We need them to make those reforms so that they can not just keep their territorial integrity, but also so that they become a stable, democratic, and prosperous country. Russian aggression in Ukraine is not going to go away or resolve itself simply because we wish it so. It'll take this comprehensive strategy that we've laid out in this amendment and coordinated political, military, and economic actions to change the current dynamic. Sanctions and economic assistance for Ukraine are important, but they're tools. They're not a strategy. Russian military action has been successful in threatening Ukraine's stability, where other attempts to use economic or political means have failed. So what they have found, the Russians and the separatists, is that they try to do it through economic means and political means. They haven't been successful there. In fact, the Ukrainians have rejected that, including by a recent election. It's no accident that their most successful tactic, the military tactic, is the one that the United States and the West has done the least to address. I have argued for months that this piecemeal reactionary response to intimidation from Moscow is a recipe for failure. Instead, we've got to have a comprehensive, proactive strategy that strengthens NATO, deters Russian aggression, and gives Ukraine the political, economic, and military support it needs to maintain its independence. We need a strategy that seeks to shape the outcome, rather than one that is shaped by them. Much of that leadership must come from us in the administration here in the United States. Of course, this body also has an important role to play, and that's what this amendment's all about. Let's include funding for Ukrainian military assistance, not just in this authorization bill where we're setting the policy forward, but let's be sure in the spending bills that follow that we provide the Ukrainians what they need. We should pass this legislation, the underlying bill, which Chairman McCain has correctly noted is critical to help us deal with so many challenges in the dangerous world that we face. And we should pass, again, this defense spending bill that doesn't leave our men and women in uniform without the means to carry out their incredibly important mission. Importantly, for today's purposes, we've got to be very clear about what the stakes are in Ukraine. Events in Ukraine are a direct and deliberate challenge to the credibility of NATO itself, to the U.S.-led international order. President Putin's actions upend decades of established international norms and threatens really the very foundation of this system order. Confidence in America and our European allies' unity and commitment to upholding this system deters bad actors. It incentivizes other countries to play by the rules. That's what we want. We want to help ensure peace, stability, and prosperity. If the credibility of our commitment is in doubt, economic collapse, more violence, more instability increases. And to avoid, chaos ensues. Ukrainians certainly understand this. They understand the importance of this conflict well beyond their borders. I hope the United States of America, we understand it. I hope we act in a way to help the Ukrainians be able to defend themselves and counter these activities on the eastern border of Ukraine.